By way of introduction, my name is Jennifer Dugan. I serve as the Director of Faculty Programs at the Associated Colleges of the South. We're joined by Charlene Bergstresser, who is the Program Director at the Lehigh Valley Association of Independent Colleges. Also with us is Susana Velazquez, Program and Budget Manager, and Christine Kimball, the Director of Strategic Procurement, both at the 5 colleges of Ohio. In terms of preliminaries, at any point during the webinar, we invite you to click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and hit send. We have saved time for your questions at the end. And also know that we are recording this session, and that will be available to all registrants on the ACL member website. Finally, there's a survey link here that we will send out through the chat function toward the end of the webinar today, and you will also get that in an email. We ask you to fill out that poll so that we can make the webinars in the future as relevant and of interest as possible. Finally, our presenters have designed an interactive session in order to make this as useful as possible for you, regardless of the type or phase of your change process. If you had a chance to attend their panel at the last ACL conference on finding the collaborative sweet spot, you will recognize Charlene and Christine's passion and expertise around managing change collaboratively and effectively. Their presentation today includes a discussion of methods, an actual case study, and specific tools for managing change. So there's a lot on our plate today, and I want to introduce our first panelist, Charlene Bergstresser.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to all of you. So we actually wanted to involve you, our audience, in our learning today. So to accomplish that, we're going to be using the Zoom polling. 3 times during our presentation, we're going to provide you with questions to consider and answer. And when prompted, you will see the polling questions and answers appear on your screen. So you're going to use your device, click on the selection of your answer. All responses are anonymous. And when we see that we have a majority of the respondents, we'll close the polling and you will be able to see the results of the polling. So we'd actually like to start and practice now. So our first polling question today is, if you think about a recent or current collaborative project, and we asked all of you at time of registration to do that, how would you describe the strategy used to execute that change? So would you say that you have an informal approach to managing change, or that you have teams or groups that focus uniquely on the change management portion of your projects? Or do you use or have used in the past a specific change management model? So we'll open up the polling and we'll get your responses to that. Okay, great. So it looks like the majority of you, 72%, pretty much use an informal approach to managing change. And that may work. That might be working just fine for you. We hope for those of you that in today's program, you might see some options for incorporating specific models or tools to help with your informal process. For those of you who actually are using have teams that are using specific change management or have some models that you prefer to use, we hope that today maybe you think about those models differently, or that this enhances what you currently are using. So great. Thank you for your response and for letting us know where you are currently. So change and change management. Why do we care about supporting or managing change? So in this picture, and if you can't see the picture, it's a parachutist jumping out of a plane wearing a red backpack on his back, only to hear the voice from the plane say, "There's a change. The red bag has the sandwiches and the green bag is your parachute," right? So we know that change can often make us feel like this, caught in a free fall, feeling like we have the wrong equipment. And as collaborators and facilitators of collaboration, we're in the business of supporting change. That's what we do. And so with the right change management models and tools, we can help to minimize that free fall experience for those we're supporting. So it might seem redundant to say this, but change management is exactly what it sounds like. It's the intentional management of change initiatives for both the individuals and the organizations experiencing the change. And if we use effective models, techniques, tools, we can minimize challenges, assure we have the right resources, and be more successful. Susana, Christina, and I recognize that you can spend several hours or even days learning about managing change, and we've got an hour today. So our goal in today's session is really to introduce you to some of the aspects of change management in a hope that you begin to think about your collaborative initiatives differently, and that you'll take some opportunities to explore new tools and techniques that you can apply to effectively move initiatives forward. Dr. Gregory Shea, who's the Senior Fellow at the Wharton Center for Leadership and Change Management, identifies there's two critical elements that you need to implement change. The first is focus on the behaviors you want to have, and the second is to design your work around those behaviors. Sounds simple enough, right? But I'm going to venture many of you feel that you start an initiative really focused on what you hope to have and something still goes awry, right? And that might be because there were aspects about the change that you may not have considered, maybe weren't noticing, or did notice and didn't know how to address. So I've highlighted here two critical aspects that you should be thinking about when you are approaching a change initiative. And they are the human elements and the system elements. So we'll start thinking about the human elements. These are centered around the people experiencing the change. They include items such as emotional, motivational, and productivity components. Adaptation to change triggers reactions that are rooted in our psychological, emotional, and physiological makeup as humans. Think about the fight or flight amygdala response. This is one of the reasons to really think about how a change initiative may be triggering human feelings of loss, fear, disengagement, helplessness. And understanding that motivational drivers for those engaging in the change might vary, one based on their emotions they're feeling and everything else around their current situation. And with those changes comes productivity, possibly comes productivity changes, which also helps individuals to have fear or skepticism. Some change initiatives rely more on an awareness of the system elements that are being impacted. And when we talk about systems, this can refer to both the individual systems that the collaborators are currently in, as well as the new system that the collaboration might be creating. Items that might be impacted in the system could be elements such as the developing efficiencies or refining existing processes or creating new processes or assuring adequate resources are available to impact the needed change. When individuals come together in collaboration, oftentimes they are creating new. That's really at the heart of collaboration. You're taking multiple things and generating something new from them. And when we're creating that new, we'll need to really be thinking about what are the impacts of both the human and the system. And often it is both. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other, but often it's both. So as the change agent, you should be thinking about this when you're starting to set out on your initiative and figuring out how that may come into play. After you've thought about that and you've said, okay, I think that my initiative may have more human impact, may have system, may have both, it might be the great time to think about, is there a specific model of change that I wish to use? In a moment, I'm going to actually be showing some different models that are available, and I'm not going to show those with the intent to teach you how to use any particular model, but I'm trying to serve as a way to highlight possible structures and components of different types of change management models. This is in no way a comprehensive review of the many different models available. One quick search will yield you an overwhelming amount of choices. So how do you shop and how do you pick? I've outlined 3 things for you to really think about when you are doing that. 1, what is the components of the particular model you're looking at? Does it focus on the things that you've identified might be important, those human systems, pieces of those? Does it fit with what you believe is the need of your particular initiative? What might be the potential benefits or barriers to utilizing that particular model? And I think actually most importantly is how comfortable are you? Have you or others that you're working with used a particular model in the past? And do you have experience using that model? If we go back to the survey, 72% of you don't typically use a formal model. So this is your time to really test and explore. For those who have used some specific models, this is a way to say, is this still working for me and will this work in my new situation? So first I'm going to demonstrate models that focus on human aspects of change. For this, I've picked the William Bridges transition model and the ProSci ADKAR model. So let's imagine for a moment that your initiative is going to collapse 2 existing work groups into one group, possibly because you found that they are duplicating work and actions. You might want to consider a model that focuses on human components because you believe that is going to be the challenge in this change and transition for these groups. If you look at the Bridges model, it focuses on 3 phases of change: ending, neutral zone, and new beginnings. And the principle behind this model is that during a change, individuals may be in different phases of transitions. And Bridges' model provides ways to notice those phases and ways to support individuals as they move through those change. In my example, you would be considering observing signs that might indicate either where individuals or the groups of individuals are in that transition. And with your observations, you might utilize different resources to help them move through the phases. Many of you might be familiar with Kubler-Ross's cycle of grief and loss, which has very similar aspects to Bridges' transition model. Now, if we go back to my scenario and you think that maybe it's more important for each individual of these groups that you're going to collapse to be bought into the change, you might want to use a model like the ProSci ADKAR model. This model highlights 5 key components to successfully help individuals move through those change moments. And this model supports this idea that if the individuals are bought in and able to move forward, the change will happen as a collective. 2 things to note when you look at these models. The first is that a change model does not need to be complex to be effective. And the second is that although these particular models appear linear, they are really regenerative and they renew and cycle as the change initiative progresses through stages. Later in the presentation, Christine will highlight the importance of the cycle in managing change. So now let's imagine that you're bringing a group together who's going to collectively implement a new system for managing their work. They have all been using separate methods, and to achieve cost effectiveness and transparency, they're going to all need to move to a similar method, different from the ones they've been using. In this scenario, you might want to consider a model that addresses some human as well as some system components of the change. In the 2 models I've shown here, Kotter's 8-step model and McKinsey's 7S model, we begin to see that the incorporation of system elements interplay with the human elements. In both models, the desired change or outcome is at the core, but Kotter's model functions in like a circular, almost like a Ferris wheel methodology, while McKinsey's is more hub and spoke with interconnectedness. Kotter's model begins with creating that urgency, building the coalition, all those human components, before you actually enable the system components. And an important thing to remember that although when you look at Kotter's model, it looks circular, you should always be checking back on those human pieces. McKinsey's model is holistic, right? It looks at those hard and soft elements and how they interplay with each other. If we think about applying that scenario of the new system of work, you might think how the new strategy will impact or change the current structures and systems, and how the individual's roles and skills might need different styles, all to help everyone get to the shared vision. So in just the past brief moment of time, we talked about the elements of change and selecting a change model. Again, there are many options available, and sometimes you can use different models in conjunction with each other. The really important thing that I'd like you to remember from this is don't be overwhelmed by the choices. Take time to figure out your current needs and find a model that you'll be comfortable using. So on that note, I'm going to transition the presentation to Susana, who'll be presenting a case study of a change initiative she was involved with.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Charlene. I was invited to contribute to today's webinar because of my experience as a program officer in strategic planning and operations, program performance and evaluation for a local Ohio government agency. This organization had adopted CQI management and as a result was consistently within the plan, implement, review, improve framework. Improvement requires a great deal of responsiveness to which change is inherent. So today I'd like to share some of the challenges I faced as a change agent in a particularly large and comprehensive project in the hope that aspects of my experience may sound familiar to you and offer some of the strategies that were effective for me. As change agents, it can sometimes feel like a tug of war, but if we are able to understand what might appear to be resistance and have some strategies and tools available to us to both anticipate and overcome some of the obstacles to progress, we will ultimately be more successful in loosening the grip on this figurative rope. On to the case study. In this case study, the agency was charged with re-engineering what is commonly referred to as a welfare to work service delivery system to identify and remediate barriers to economic self-sufficiency and provide skill development programs and opportunities. These systems typically target populations considered to be hard to serve and often have a combination of low education attainment, underdeveloped hard and soft skills, lack of material resources, and unmet physical and mental health needs. As the illustration depicts, these systems feature a risk assessment phase to address immediate needs, a job readiness assessment to determine preparatory needs, and service delivery phase. Players and stakeholders would include our clients, our case and social workers, our management staff, political interests, community advocates, and our service delivery providers. At the time, there were legislative mandates this project was intended to satisfy, and a recent turnover in political leadership under the veil of corruption. So the environment was ripe for change, and there was considerable disagreement on what direction to take. The project required bringing these groups together to develop, design, and implement a model to provide efficient and reliable assessment results that could identify and measure remediation impact, intervention effectiveness, and intended outcomes, meaning results had to measure not only the consumption of services, but also the outcomes in real time on a web-based platform. The project activities included gathering a substantial amount of input from stakeholders to develop system requirements, rethinking the who, when, and how of delivering services, introduction of new reporting tools, and hard skills training of users on the new platform. You might imagine with an effort of this magnitude and such a far-reaching impact and involvement, there were quite a few challenges and obstacles to sustaining progress and moving forward. I've chosen 3 examples that I think are not uncommon to many change efforts and some of the strategies used which I felt had the biggest impact. One challenge we faced was managing stakeholders. From the onset of the project, naturally, a representation of stakeholders needed to be assembled and brought to the table for input and discussion. We knew some groups had pre-formed ideas, which is what we wanted, people who had already given the issue a considerable amount of thought. We also understood that among this group were dissenters to the direction that had already been selected. We knew when working within the social service sector that these were people that These were very people-focused and centered professionals, caseworkers, community advocates, and that systems conversations would be challenging. Our task then became how to keep groups engaged and contributing, and to foster a systems discussion where they felt heard, they felt valued as contributors, and where we could communicate alignment between these specific interests and the overall direction of the project. At the time, we had recently completed some team building workshops, and we learned that our IT group and our caseworkers were simply different beings living on different planets who spoke completely different languages. Simply knowing this much changed how we listened and what we heard. What may have sounded like a disagreement in the past was now a misalignment, and that was a lot easier for us to address. Since our stakeholders had different value systems and heard messages in a different way, we learned to be multilingual in our approach, taking time to identify the priorities and the deal breakers, and doing a lot of translating among groups, constantly vigilant for the opportunities for agreement, and being very mindful to distinguish issues from positions. Coming back to the big picture was essential in this project. Because the scope was so far-reaching and each group really had a much smaller slice of that pie, it was important to keep everyone abreast of where the other areas of the project were headed, and collectively how each audience was supporting the overall forward movement. Another challenge within this project was engineering a new workflow. As I mentioned previously, a major component of this project was the development of a web platform to facilitate the gathering and conveyance of information about the clients, the services they were receiving, and the outcomes they had achieved. In order to obtain the greatest level of efficiency, it would be necessary to both add steps to the process as well as remove long-standing practices. Over time, staff had developed their own way of doing things, practices for which there was a tremendous amount of ownership and confidence, and letting those go in place of something that was new and unproven created concern among key staff. In this venture, and at the time, the idea of modernizing also had become synonymous with downsizing. So we had the triple threat of loss of ownership, loss of position, and retooling roles and responsibilities. So the training and rollout strategy featured flexibility. To best serve this audience of adult learners, we designed a training plan that touched on as many modalities that we could practically provide, including online versus in-person, written, visual, and practical, as well as on-site and off-site. Throughout the training and rollout, we encountered a fair amount of snags, errors, unexpected results, and audiences needed to be reassured that these missteps were an expected and necessary element of the process. This phase of discovery is vital to be able to address and correct and demonstrate that when and if something unexpected arises, that the process is resilient enough that it can be managed. Absence of this reassurance would fuel the impression that somehow it won't work, or look, it's already failing. Another strategy that was instrumental in the development and rollout of the process was the recognition of the rising stars. Remembering the fact that our audience was a largely people, relationship-centered group, we needed to highlight the performance of the individuals and not so much the system. So instead of touting, look how great the system had performed this past week, the narrative became, look how much progress George has made, or look how much more productive Jane has become. This discussion then creates the value that was needed to encourage and support sustainability. The last example I offer is on what lies ahead. So now that we are near the end, systems have been deployed, staff has been trained, clients are flowing, information is being generated. Now what? We have just changed the environment in which we work and our clients live. What will we learn? And more importantly, what will we do with what we learn? Creating a desirable culture post-change is just as important as getting through the change phase itself. The past isn't so far behind that it isn't remembered fondly by some, and therefore an option to return to should this new thing not work out. So it was important for us to continue the messaging and demonstrating that what we had endured was worth every ounce of effort, because the possibility of where we can now go is so much more promising. In this scenario, the system now provided data that showed the agency wasn't doing as well as perhaps some had thought. The agency had to recognize, own, and resolve those issues together and not assign those issues away to separate departments and heads and managers. Part of how this was accomplished was in sharing the risk that the changes had uncovered. So for example, performance outcomes weren't as expected. The agency had recently made a significant contract change to performance-based repayment and incentives, which meant that for our service providers, it was no longer profitable to contract with the agency. The risk far outweighed the potential for reward. But in being able to present the data, support the argument, and restructure contracts in a way that the nonprofit partner could continue to serve our clients in a cost-effective manner and shift service delivery priorities from provision to performance, we demonstrated a cooperative spirit, a willingness to assume and share financial risk, and the change effort now affected a culture shift that says we're in this together. So I hope some of this was helpful to you and perhaps could resonate with some of the aspects of your own work. And with that, I will turn it back over to Charlene, who has another polling question for you.
So thank you, Susana. So yes, now we'd like to hear from the audience again about your change initiatives. So after hearing some of the aspects of change and Susana's case study, where do you think you are struggling the most? Getting community support for the project, working through stakeholder interest, decision processes impacting the forward movement, accessing the right resources, or maybe it's all of these. So we'll open up the poll for you. Okay, wow. So we've got a little bit of different aspects going on here. So we've got someone out there who's having tough time getting community support for their project. The largest percentage of you are it's working through those stakeholder interests, right? And you heard Susana talk about this. This is, again, oftentimes that human piece that we talked about. And then the decision processes impacting movement, great. So, and we've got some 3 of you out there who says all of this. Well, as we transition this presentation to Christine now, she's going to talk about some tools and resources that hopefully will help you combat some of these common challenges.
Thanks, Charlene, and thanks, Susana, for the great scenario. We've heard Charlene explain models of change management, and we've had Susana walk us through real challenges and strategies she's experienced to affect change. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to focus on tools and resources that can help you facilitate change in your projects and institutions. Similar to the wide variety of change management models, there are a wide variety of change management tools and resources available. I'll touch on a few of them in the upcoming slides, but I'd like to stress the importance of investigating and selecting specific tools which will facilitate the change that you're trying to achieve. Incorporating these tools into your project plan will allow you to deploy them at the appropriate time in the project. So, what time is the right time for change management in your project? Some might say anytime, some might say all the time. I think I tend to agree with both of those statements, but I'd also add at the appropriate time. The deployment of proper change management tools requires planning within your project. Now, this slide shows a typical change process for an average project. Change processes may vary from project to project, but a form of these elements typically appear in each project. You have the catalyst for change or the request for the change. You have some sort of analysis that says, what will this change do for my organization? And then you have the go-ahead to move forward with the project or not. At that point, if you're going ahead, you're going to implement the change, and then you'll wrap up and review and report and evaluate your project for success. I'm starting with the tool discussion with this slide because there are specific change management tools that are applicable to the entire project, but there are also specific tools that will be focusing on specific phases. It's really important to plan your tools for the appropriate phase to achieve maximum benefit. So an example of this would be, let's say, in phase 5, you're really interested in reviewing and reporting on the success of your project. Well, in order to prepare for that, it's critical to identify what is the criteria for success early in that request for change and impact analysis phase. This is important because you don't want to end up arriving at phase 5 without any of the data or details to analyze and say, did we succeed or not? Knowing what that criteria is at the onset of your project is going to help you collect the information that's going to make it easier to do the reporting and reviewing activities in phase 5. So now, the size of this chart is really small. This isn't an eye test. At the end of our session, we're going to present you with a link that will take you to these slides and then also share these resources for you so you can review them in detail at your leisure. So let's start with your organization's culture. A good tool to start with is a culture map. Why is it important to understand your culture? Understanding your culture helps you envision a path to success. It can also help you identify potential stumbling blocks and can help you plan timeframes, resources, and additional tools you might need to help you succeed. This particular map addresses a couple of things. It addresses outcomes, behaviors, enablers, and blockers. When we think of outcomes, a culture map can be used to help you realize how long does it take to complete a project in my culture? How much funding is available to my organization? And how much project structure can my culture handle? Knowing these items ahead of time can help you plan appropriately. When it comes to behaviors, as Susana mentioned, factor greatly into the success of a project. So understanding, does my culture approach change with denial, or are they ambivalent to change? Perhaps they like to experiment and are creative. Utilize and plan for all of those behaviors in your tool planning process to be the most effective that you can be. Lastly, we talk about things that enable and block the success of our project. So what you'll want to do with your culture map is understand, are there things in my culture which will block my success? Perhaps these, or will they enable my success? So perhaps you look to your leadership as someone who will help enable this. But then there could be other things like a vast array of physical locations that might block success. Rewards can be enablers. Rules may help us. Sometimes they're a challenge. And then we look at individual routines of staff, faculty, students, and input those into our project. A culture map is a good tool because it keeps the group focused on what type of results come out of your specific culture, the behaviors that contribute to these results, and the people and the action which could potentially get in the way of your success. As Charlene described earlier in our webinar, there are many proven models available to facilitate change. And what you'll find as you explore these models is many of them have tool sets that were developed to use with the model. This tool set is an example of that, and it shows the phases of change in ADKAR's model. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side are the ADKAR phases of change. What you're seeing on the right-hand side are categories of change management tools which may help in the particular phases. So a way to interpret this map, if you look at your awareness phase can be connected to communications, sponsorship roadmap, and coaching. At the bottom of the chart, we'll look at ability. And ability can also look to coaching for a method to deploy that type of tool, and include training as well. We may overlap in the style of tool. However, the focus based on the phase that we're in will represent a different utilization of the tool. And it's important to keep that in mind during your planning session. By understanding which tools help you facilitate certain objectives, you can deploy the right tool at the right time in your project. While communication is just one of many elements of change, I'm calling it out with a slide of its own, because projects have succeeded and failed based on effective or ineffective communication. This illustration on this slide shows the relationship between stakeholders with interest in your change and those who have the power to influence your change. I find this tool really valuable because it reminds me that communication isn't reserved for the hands-on key players in our project, but should be directed to the entire organization in varying levels. So when we look at the chart, we look at spectators, we look at active players, we looked at influential observers, we looked at key players. By positioning your stakeholders in the appropriate quadrant early in the project, you can plan your communication effectively. A lot of communication is good, but too much communication is as detrimental as not enough. Target your stakeholders with purpose and communicate at the appropriate level. So we can plan and design a process for a project success. However, at some point, we will inevitably face challenges or even possibly failure. In order to address challenges or failure, we have to identify the cause or source. And this can be tricky to accomplish in a reasonable time frame while you're in the middle of a big project. This last slide is a change framework tool that's a favorite of many, and Charlene and I brought this about in our session at the last ACL conference. It is a really useful tool to help identify causes and sources of failure. Behavior experts and educators, Timothy Noster and all, believe specific conditions are required to sustain change. And when one of these conditions are missing, a specific emotion or consequence occurs. So they believe the specific conditions to sustain change are a vision, a set of skills, incentives, resources, and a plan. So how do we connect a challenge or a failure point in a project to a specific condition of change? While that challenge or failure part can be hard to identify, it's relatively easy to identify the emotion around a problem. This tool is designed to predict a missing condition of change by starting with a person or group's emotion. So select a visible emotion from the right column and slide over to the left to find the missing condition. An example would be, I have a group that is very anxious. If you slide over to the left, what you'll see missing is the skills box. Perhaps they're anxious because they're not sure they're going to be able to accomplish what's going to be asked of them. This tool ends up being very, very useful in pinpointing areas to target. While it isn't foolproof, it will help project leads start to focus on the area of the problem and can reduce a broad area of potential challenges into a much narrow field to analyze for problems. Like the areas of change models and the examples of change scenarios, tools and resources are a really large topic, and we could speak at great length to them. We hope the examples that we've shared here will encourage you to discover more about how to incorporate change management into your projects and into your consortium. So to wrap up our session, we'll take one last poll. The question for our last poll is, as a follow-up from today's session, I will approach a change initiative in a way, approach a change initiative I have in a different way, continue to explore different models and tools that I can use, seek more formal guidance to support change within my consortial projects, all of these, or perhaps none of these. So we will launch the poll and wait for some results here. Okay, looks like we're almost in. I'll go ahead and share our results. So, looks like all of these were of benefit to you. This really is a positive response. So what that says is you're going to keep looking into change management as a method to garner success for your projects. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand the reins over to Jennifer for our final activity.
Thank you very much to our panelists. We do have a little over 15 minutes for discussion, and I'd like to start off with a question we received, which is, given all the models available, what is the best one to use in a consortial-based change process?
Well, I'll start with attempting to answer that question. This is Charlene. So I think I really want to come back to what's going on. So as I said, often in consortial change processes, there's a little bit of everything, right? Because you're bringing maybe different groups together who have different styles and communication methodologies. You might be shifting up their way of doing whatever work if they're taking on some type of a new initiative. And I think it's considering all those pieces. There is no right or wrong answer. It's considering all those pieces and really trying to find something that might fit, or several tools and or models that might fit. And I don't want to forget that piece about being comfortable, right? And remembering to be comfortable. I don't know, Christine, if you have something you want to add to that.
Well, I think this is where your tools can come in. So, especially when we start talking about, identifying what your culture is. Sometimes these utilizing tools like a culture map can help you understand which model will be successful for your organization. So in identifying what your needs are, what your standard behaviors are, what your challenges are in your culture, you then go ahead and evaluate and pick a model that might address those behaviors, needs, and challenges specifically.
Okay, we do have another question, which is really interesting. We have a more informal approach. Is using a model that important, and what are we missing by not using one?
Again, I'll jump in first. That's a great question. So I'd say if your informal approach is working, there's certainly a component of that if you're doing something consistently, it's maybe informal, but consistent informal. And if it's working for you, that's great. I think your opportunity maybe even would be to use a model such as, like, if you use the McKinsey model, you can almost do that as a check and balance to validate, are you actually successful in moving your initiatives as successful as you could be, or maybe the benefit of adding a formal model would raise your bar just a little more. So there might be things that you're not aware you're missing, and by adding in a formal model, it might help you assess for those missing elements.
And I'd like to add to that too, if I could. So what you may realize as you study some of these models is that you're already doing it. You just don't know the name of the model you're using, right? So some of these models may seem very intuitive, and they may be something that's already in practice in your organization. And to what Charlene said, by learning those models and recognizing when one already works for you, you can just take that a step further, enhance that with additional tools and processes of change that might augment your success.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have questions rolling in with some 10 minutes or so left. The next one is, when working with consortia, you're working with multiple and potentially conflicting cultures. How do you assess the culture of the cultures?
I can take that and kind of use an example. So I have similar colleges, but there are nuanced differences to cultures. And what I've found is, for projects to succeed, each college needs to be identified individually, and given that that statement of recognition for who they are. In identifying each of those colleges, what I have found as a successful model is find where the overlaps are then. So go ahead and do that cultural assessment of each college. And in all likelihood, you're going to have 3 or 4 points where there's some commonality amongst your consortia. They wouldn't want to work together or be part of a consortium unless there weren't some points that they have found historically they've been able to work on. So treat everybody individually, but then look for the commonality is how I would approach that.
I think too, this is a way to get your participants engaged, right? Seek that information from them. Like, what do you think is unique about your culture, and how might it blend with others as we continue forward with this project? So it helps in engaging those participants too.
Our next question is, what pitfalls should a new manager be careful to avoid? In your opinion, is it easier or harder for a new leader to affect change?
Yes.
right, exactly.
So I think some of the pitfalls, right? So this goes, part of this goes to what Christine said about communication, right? Finding the right balance of communication and seeking input from others. So it can be easier for a new leader if the group is starved for change and they haven't been happy with where they've been. But if the group has been stagnant or is actually comfortable with where they are, and you want to affect change as a leader, it might be more challenging. And so you'll have to test that environment. You'll have to communicate and explore with the people you're working with. I don't know if Christine or Susana want to add something to that.
Yeah, I could add to that. So the other piece, in addition to communication, is I would assess behaviors. And so we've spent a lot of focus on the behavior of the culture in which we're trying to facilitate change. we want to keep our focus on that, but we also want to look to the behavior of our change agents. And this question kind of hits that right on the head, right? So what would a new manager be careful to avoid? I would really caution a new manager as coming in to a scenario, knowing everything and ready to change the world, right? So I would try to find a happy medium between honoring the history and the legacy of what you're walking into while becoming that voice of experience and expertise that will bring an external alternate view to an existing problem. So a new manager has a nice leverage point in that you do have external experience. Pretty much you're a magician and no one's seen your tricks yet, right? So if you come in and wow them with some of your tricks, those are the kinds of things that might build confidence, that might give folks, a willingness to participate and get excited about your project. Coming on too strong, knowing it all, telling everybody, well, this is the way that's going to solve all your problems because you haven't been doing it right. That is a huge pitfall, and I would caution against that.
Yeah, the Bridges model, the Bridges transition model that I showed earlier is a great model to think about when you're a new manager, right? Because what Bridges says is everyone around you is experiencing the change of you being a new manager, including you, and everyone's going to be moving through that transition differently. And so really being aware of where are the people around you and where are you in that change of being a new manager, having a sense of understanding around that gives you an understanding for preparedness and readiness as well.
Thank you. We want to encourage our attendees to send in their questions. The next one is, I think it is important to measure changes that are implemented. If the change you want to affect is a culture shift within the organization, what do you recommend for measuring such change?
I can start to answer and then the others can join in. So I think, what do you mean by culture shift? So I think that's being clear and understanding what about the culture isn't currently working and what do you want that culture to look like in the future. And so that's where you're going to get some of your measurement from. Culture is a tough thing, right? It's tough to measure that with hard numbers, but you'll know it when you get there, right? That's usually how folks feel about culture shifts. But there are certain behaviors, this is back to behaviors Christine talked about as well, there are certain behaviors that can indicate you are making a culture shift. And if you can measure those behaviors or the shift in those behaviors, that's one way you can measure your change.
I would offer too, again, to just continue on Charlene's points, is focusing on those behaviors. So really be specific about, for example, do I want to see more employees partaking in certain activities? Or do I want to see more of my student body engaging in certain groups? And those you can apply a metric to, that's an observable that you can sort of take a pre and a post. Another potential might be pre and post surveys that just measure attitudes about certain organizations or processes or activities. Those might help. Again, indicators of culture shifts, absolute measures, that's a harder thing to do because of all of the subjectivity that's involved in even determining, what a culture of an organization is. But, those are just a couple of examples of things that, if you need something quantifiable, that gives you a start.
And to add on to what Susana has just mentioned, really, really critical, identify what you want to measure early on, because in order to create that pre and post metric, you have to be collecting the data. And so at the end, it's really nice to say, oh boy, wouldn't it be great? This would tell us exactly how successful we are. If we did not plan that into our process, we may not have been collecting the right type of information to produce that type of metric. So I've learned this the hard way by getting to the end and going, boy, if only I had. So take time in the beginning to start thinking about what you envision the end to be. You know, you may not make it. It may not be exactly spot on, but it will be better than coming into the end totally unprepared.
And part of your journey might be learning that what you originally thought you wanted the end to be is not that.
Exactly.
Something else.
Thank you. We have another question that I think will be of interest to many of our consortial colleagues. And that is, my consortium staff is an office of one. And I still use any of these models shared as only one person.
Yes.
Yes.
I'll just kind of jump in first on that, if that's okay. You know, so I think many of us are focused with a small staff. And what I have found is I have engaged the staff members at our colleges into our projects, into this leadership role of the change management deployment. And what that does is a couple of things. It gives you an augmented staff base that can help you, because we are only one person and there is a finite amount that we can accomplish individually. But secondarily, it creates an ownership of the project at the college level. So these are people now who are in that unique position of being peers with all of those folks at the colleges, but also being part of the bigger process and helping deploy that. And that gives them a unique position of balance. And it also gives them an opportunity to be instrumental in the change that's going to affect key individuals. Typically, when I look for change agents at the college level, it ends up being some really key folks who are involved in a great span of the project and can contribute accordingly.
Looks like we have one final question, and that is regarding whether there are professional development opportunities for staff to learn about these models and be as prepared as possible for engaging in effective change.
There's a lot of resources out there. So there are formal courses you can take for some of these change management models. There's a wealth of information out on the internet if you just are researching any particular change management model that will highlight some tools. Christine?
Yeah, I mean, you can be as informal or as formal as you like. I think now even there are degrees conferred in change management, or at least strong minors. So there's definitely groups that specialize, associations, professional associations that specialize in change management, and they may very well have credits that would be available to support your professional development.
The important part is just keep exploring. Like, that's what I would recommend to folks. Just keep looking and testing, talking to others.
Okay, is that all for the questions?
We certainly want to thank our panelists today, and you should see in your chat window that I just sent out the poll. We encourage you to click on that and fill out the poll or respond to it when you get it in your email. We also invite you to stay tuned for news about our next webinar in the late spring, Surviving Presidential Turnover and Sustaining Collaborative Momentum. Thank you once again to our panelists, and we hope you have a wonderful day.